Blood was on his hands before he knew it belonged to anyone but himself. A warm smear across the back of his jacket, the iron tang that always meant someone had bled on his turf. Mira's fingers dug into his sleeve like a frightened animal clinging to a ledge. Her nails left crescent moons of red on his skin. She was a trembling thing under the lamplight, hair matted to her cheeks with salt and rain and something else he couldn't name, eyes blown wide and liquid with fear. "Please," she begged, and the syllable was a raw, half-broken thing that broke something in his chest he had kept sealed for years. The part that remembered first loyalties, first vows, the small, dangerous softness of wanting to keep someone alive even when duty said otherwise. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Elias Marlowe had built his life on two certainties. A pack's survival required iron rules, and the Coven's ancient words were the mortar that held the city's fragile peace together. He smelled the rain and the salt on Mira first, and beneath that, the strange animal tang of wolf-laced blood. The elders had sent him a dossier, a smear of rumor and old ink that called her a curse, a breach in the pact, a danger that had to be contained. And yet, here she was, not snarling, not tearing at him with sharpened teeth, but shaking as though the moon had already forced its way into her bones. She was 19 and sick with terror, not with rapture. "Alpha," said Micah, his second, voice low like gravel and steady where Elias needed steadiness. "We found her outside Fisher's Wharf. The Santos family left 3 nights ago from the coastal town. The witch isn't here yet," Elias cut in. He said it without thinking, because the witch's name meant trouble so old it tasted like rust. The Coven didn't travel for minor curses. When they came, it was to bargain and to break things on purpose. "Bring her to the precinct, quietly. We don't need a mob, and we don't need the Coven sending envoys until I know what the truth is." Mira's breath came shallow and fast, a rhythm like a bird's trapped in a cage. When she spoke, it was not with the growl the old stories promised, but in a whimper that made his jaw ache. "They said you'd—" She swallowed. "They said you'd kill me." The words unearthed something older than his duty, the part of him that had been a boy once, small and furious when wolves he didn't understand were blamed for fishermen's cows. He had been taught to be certain as a creed. Now certainty tangled with the inexplicable fact of Mira's fear. He let the men ease her into the private wagon rather than a cell. Protocol demanded chains and symbols, but his hand hovered a second on the burlap throw that would have been used to bind her wrists. He did not force it. The refusal felt like a small heresy. Stonebridge sat asleep with the river making silver tracks under the moon. The precinct was brick and low, smelling of boiled coffee and old blood. It was decorated not with flags, but with the carved runes of pacts hung like talismans from the beams. The council room, where Elias would have to answer questions and remember every clause of the treaty that bound shifters and vampires and kept humans from being turned into collateral damage, had a long table polished with generations of hands. The envelopes on its surface held stamped notices from the Coven, an undercurrent of watchful velvet menace. Politics breathed there like a living thing. Mira sat on the far bench, knees drawn up, the lamplight making her flesh papery and small. Up close, she smelled of the sea and of lilies and the faint burn of grief. Her hands trembled and splashed salt water onto her jeans, where in the distance of his memory he recognized the pattern of a first transformation gone wrong, a child's account of a witch's promise and a moon that didn't behave. Her left hand twitched, nails gouged shallow crescents, as if she had clawed herself back from a place he had never seen. "Tell me your name," Elias said at last. He didn't mean it to be gentle. The word gentle rarely lived in his sentences. It came out softer than he expected, like a concession he didn't entirely understand. "Mira," she said, "Mira Santos, we were trying to leave. My mother said the tides got angry. The villagers blamed me when old Vela cursed me. She said something about a bargain gone bad. We walked into town to find help." Her eyes darted. Beneath the fear, there was a quick, bright intelligence. "You can ask anyone. I didn't hurt anyone." "You awoke in wolf blood," Micah said, not unkindly. "In the woods beyond the east docks, 3 sheep down. Fishermen reported strange tracks. We do our duty." Mira's mouth trembled. "It wasn't me. It wakes wrong. The moon, it's not our moon." Elias felt the room tilt for a heartbeat. Every alpha in his lineage had felt the moon. It was a steady drum in the pack's chest, a calendar and a covenant. The pact that kept Stonebridge from burning was built on rhythms. Shifters afflicted to certain nights, vampires taking blood in coin and oath, witches sworn not to meddle in exchange for sanctuary. To say the moon was not ours was scripture-breaking blasphemy. He had to present a face to the men gathered in the precinct. Men who sniffed like hounds for weakness, and women with knives like truths tucked in their belts. He also had to think of the coven, the velvet, age-old people who kept their own counsel beneath the city like roots. Visitors from the vampire courts had been more frequent in recent months. Their envoy, a thin, pale man with eyes like chipped glass, who liked to test the edge of treaties with words. If they smelled any weakness, if they saw one of his pack as volatile, the coven would lean in like a tide. "Micah," Elias said quietly, "seal the perimeter. No gossip, no wandering eyes. Keep her here. I'll send word to the council. No one is to meet with coven envoys until I call them." Micah's nod was small but absolute. The men left quietly. Their footfalls were the only noise aside from the rain. Once the room was empty enough for a dangerous kind of intimacy, Elias sat across from Mira, hands clasped, Alpha bearing down like an anchor. "Why did the witch mark you?" he asked. It was standard procedure to ask and to record. He felt like he was reciting old prayers his mouth had been taught to carry. But Mira's answer was not the kind of admission that fit in files and file cabinet memories. "I don't know." Her voice shredded at that point. "Old Vela said she was settling a debt with the coven. She promised them a tidy thing, a child who would mark the sea and give them an advantage with the tides. When I changed, the change answered to the wrong moon. I saw faces I don't know, and I screamed, and my father—" She stilled, throat working. "They turned on us. My brother June said we had to run because the sheriff would hear and the coven would want to take me. They said the coven would—I don't know." Elias watched the way grief made her small. He weighed oath and politics in the same breath as the aching urge to protect what was in front of him. He had been Alpha for 4 years, 7 months, and a day, a tally he kept only to remind himself of the price. He had defended borders, brokered peace between packs, and escorted vampire envoys through back alleys when coven elders had insisted. He had been praised for his discretion and scolded for his severity. He had never been tempted, until tonight, to break protocol for someone who was, by all accounts, supposed to be a hazard. Outside, the river made its habitual complaint against the quay, and a gull cried, an ordinary sound that made everything else alarming, the meeting of myriads of lives under strange obligations. He had a pack to protect. He had a pact to uphold. He had a council to appease. And he had a girl on a bench who looked at him like the moon had betrayed her. "You're coming before the council," Elias said finally. You should understand that there are two possible outcomes. If the coven decides your condition breaks the pact, there will be a ritual. If they decide you are an abomination, there will be eradication. Or, and this is mine to try, we could petition for a private hearing. You will remain under watch while I gather testimony. Mira's eyes lit, a dangerous, hopeful light he had not expected. A private hearing? She whispered. You will help me? I will investigate, he corrected, because alpha words were careful weapons. But when she looked at him with the rawness of someone who had been running from harm for days, his voice softened without his consent. I will try to find the truth before the coven wraps it in their riddles. It was a promise he hadn't intended to make. It was, suddenly, the only honest thing he could offer. He knew the calculations the coven favored. Old bargains, blood for silence, the way witches could be coaxed into revealing half-truths if their greed found the right price. He also knew that the longer Mira remained in limbo, the more eager the coven and the older vampires would be to press for spectacle over justice. A difficult dilemma unfurled like a map of knives: protect the city by following the treaty and risk condemning a frightened girl whose affliction might be a mutation rather than a malevolence, or defy the coven enough to buy time, risking his position and the stability he'd been taught to hold above all else. To add weight, there were rumors already. Old Valas' name, the whisper of a witch's bargain with a vampire elder, the hint that this was not an accident but a cover for a theft that had cost someone their leverage. The council would demand answers. The coven would take whatever interpretation served their future. Elias rose, feeling the heavy, old authority like a cloak on his shoulders. Political survival would demand delicacy. The pack's survival might demand coldness. But as he looked at Mira, at the dirt still under her nails and the way her shoulders shook when she breathed, the Alpha felt something else, that perhaps the stability he had sworn to preserve was not the same as justice. Rest, he said, because the only small mercy he could afford in a room full of statutes was a human word. Don't sleep out on the steps, Jillian will bring you blankets. He meant to leave a guard, and he knew his men would watch her like hawks. But he also left because the council would not wait, and because when a problem was given names and files and witnesses, it could be argued and measured problems, he had been taught, were solvable. In the hallway, he paused once to look back. Mira had curled into herself like a thing that could be folded away. Under the lamplight, she looked less like a monster and more like a child who had been abandoned by the tides. Elias felt the old stories tug at his throat, the coven's parchment, the blood pacts, the price of allowing witches their bargains. He folded those stories into his pocket and walked toward the council, knowing that by dawn there would be old men in velvet, a pale envoy with glassy eyes, and the slow, inevitable machinery of the pact clanking into motion. He also knew, with a certainty that felt both reckless and true, that whatever the council decided would not be the only thing that mattered. There were other truths, smaller and rawer: salt on a girl's hair, a scream at midnight, a moon that answered to a different naming. Those truths would not honor treaties. They might, if he allowed them, rewrite the rules. They called the council for dawn, and were still arguing when the sun made the river look like a bruise. Men and women with the patience of vultures sorted through testimony like bones. The coven's envoy, a slim alabaster man named Lysander, whose smile came already practiced for the cameras of old power, watched Mira as if calculating whether she would make a useful toy or a dangerous weapon. He never reached out. His fingers were folded in the way of men who had been taught to keep their possessions in velvet. His voice, when he spoke, tasted of comparison. "This is no mere anomaly," Lysander said, leaning on the table like a man who expected the world to bend under his weight. A transformation untethered to the lunar accord destabilizes the old framework. If the pack shelters such unpredictability, the coven cannot guarantee the sanctity of its agreements. Sanctity, Micah echoed, his tone the sound of a blade being lifted from a scabbard. He was pragmatic and blunt. He smelled like old smoke and river mud. Sanctity doesn't mean slaughter. There are processes. Processes are for the obedient, Lysander countered. His eyes flicked to Elias, measuring the alpha as though he were an unpolished coin. We could perform a cleansing ritual, remove the taint, eliminate the hazard. Every time the word eliminate left a velvet mouth, it made the air in the room colder. The phrase had a long history in the city, a euphemism that had emptied many rooms of living things and left only memory and the careful filing of causes. Elias felt the room narrow, heard the crowd of old pacts whispering in their carved boards. He had been raised in that whisper. It was both lullaby and law. He thought of Mira hunched on the bench, of her small, shaking wrist tucked beneath her thigh. He imagined old Vela's crooked hands and the promise she had whispered to the coven, a barter wrapped in superstition and the hunger for leverage. If the witch had cut a deal and given them a child marked to a different moon, what had she been paid? What price had been transferred into the coven's accounts of power? Questions stacked like plates he didn't know how to balance. "Send for old Vela," Elias said, and the words pierced the den like a bell. "And send no one else. This is a matter for Stonebridge until we know more." Lysander smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "We don't trust your judgment alone, Alpha Marlowe. The coven insists on an observer, a witness to the ritual." "You will be allowed to appoint one witness," Elias said, keeping his voice even. "But there will be no ritual until we can observe the pattern. We will take testimony, collect evidence, and seek the witch's account. Until then, Mira Santos remains under pack protection." That last clause brought more grumbles than anything. Protection was an expense, a folly in the eyes of some. To others, it smelled of favoritism. One of the older pack members, a woman whose face had been folded by winters into a map of lines, muttered about precedent and the risk of setting a soft example. Elias felt the throb of the precarious line he walked. Leaders were remembered either for the lives they kept or the reputations they bled to maintain. They did not have to wait long for complications. Old Vela answered the summons with a slow, proud step and no apology. She arrived smelling of seaweed and pepper and something alkaline, as if she had kept the ocean under her skirts. Her hair was a white storm. Her eyes were the green of salt-stained glass. "You called?" she rasped, her voice the sound of something scraped from a keel. She looked at Mira like a mariner checking the horizon. "You should never have left her in their hands. My bargain—" "Your bargain," Lysander interrupted, his tone silk over iron, "was with us. You pledged a boon to the coven. If you miscast or miscommunicated, you must answer." Vela's mouth thinned. She let the accusation settle like a net, then folded it away. "I pledged what I pledged," she said. "The thread of fate is frayed in places. Children can't be guaranteed. I am not the city council. But I did not curse this girl to the wrong moon." Mira's voice, small and high as a gull's cry, forced its way between their words. "She did it, old Vela. You changed me, and it hurt, and then everyone looked at me like I was—" She broke off, immediate and raw. "You told them I was marked for their benefit. You told them I'd be worth something. I never agreed." Vela's eyes flickered, a quick animal motion. "No one asks a child to agree to a bargain, Mira Santos. Bargains are elder work." Elias felt his stomach clench. The argument was moving like a tide toward blame. He wanted to pull Mira out of the hall and into a place that smelled only of old wood and the quiet of men who could be trusted to keep their hands to themselves. Instead, he watched, because the council watched him as well. Every choice would be dissected and the bones kept for argument. "There's more to this," Micah muttered at his shoulder once they were alone in the corridor. "Vela's evasive. Lysander is smell-testing for weakness. And your boys are already whispering of exile if the coven demands." "Then we buy time," Elias said. The words had a flatness he didn't like. Long tradition taught negotiating with time. Delay was often a way to starve hunger for spectacle. We gather, we test, we find a pattern. But tests required resources. He ordered blood assays at the infirmary, old rites of scent and trace to be performed by the pack's healer, a woman whose hands could read a body's weather like a tarot. He demanded surveillance of Mira's sleep, a watchful rotation to see if she convulsed under moons that were not full. He wanted witnesses, fishermen who had seen odd tracks, the Santos family, the sheriff with his thin file, and anyone who had seen Vela in the nights before the change. Mira agreed to the tests with the quiet of the exhausted. She submitted her wrist without drama, watched the needles with a curious steadiness that made Elias uncomfortable, as though some part of her still cataloged what it meant to be observed. That very absence of panic felt dangerous, like an animal that had learned not to react. She let the healer probe her skin and ask questions about childhood fevers and strange dreams. She spoke of tides that sang to her, of seeing a second moon, faint and quick, like a thought that had been pressed wrong into the world. She told of nights in which the sea tasted like iron, and strangers' faces brushed the edges of her vision. And when she said the word faces, her voice hollowed. In the quiet of the infirmary, with the healer's herbs steaming like a small forest, Mira's back pressed into the edge of the cot, and she confessed, low, "It doesn't come always with the big moon. Sometimes it's the new moon's shadow that calls me. Sometimes it's the moon that fishermen call the bride, the one that appears with storms. Once I changed during a noon bell when the clouds hid the sky. I woke covered in dirt, and someone had put salt in my hair." Elias listened and felt like a surgeon learning a scar's history, each seam another possible cause. He had never heard of a transformation tethered to a different lunar body. The old treaties assumed lunar regularity. The pack's cycles were a map that everyone had agreed to follow. If Mira's change answered instead to other moons, storm moons, tide moons, the invisible moons fishermen swore to, then the whole tattoo of agreement could be illegible. "You hide," Mira said suddenly that night, when the world outside smelled like rain-soaked asphalt and the pack's lanterns burned a steady sputter. Her hands were folded in her lap. The tendons stood out white under skin. "Why do you protect them? You keep the coven at bay, and you make rules. Why keep a pact that lets people be sold for power?" Elias didn't answer immediately. The question landed on him like a stone. He could have recited the old catechism. The pact preserved lives. The covenant prevented the vampires from turning on humans en masse. Witches were kept from undue influence. He could have replied with the practiced rhetoric of an alpha. Instead, he told her, "Because once you start unmaking what keeps people alive, there's no neat list of what comes after." "People are dying now," she said. "My family had to run. My brother sleeps with a knife. My mother knits her hands raw waiting for an envoy to decide whether she'll be taken for bargaining. Is that the thing you call keeping them alive?" The protest in her voice was not naive. It was a sharp blade that had been turned on the very heart of his supposed virtue. Her accusation made him small in a way he wasn't used to being, reduced not by force, but by the moral weight of having kept a system that allowed such fear to flourish. He wanted to tell her that duty required cold calculus, that a life could sometimes require a dozen quiet deaths for the many. He wanted to teach her patience and the long arc of politics. But he had been an alpha long enough to know that systems were built by people who never asked about the small things, the frightened faces, the salt in hair. "What would you have me do?" he asked instead. His question was not rhetorical. He was asking because she had been asking him to choose, and he had always been trained not to let choice feel like mercy. Mira's laugh when it came was brittle. "Not let them decide for me," she said. "Not wait for an old man in velvet to stamp a paper and call me a problem. Teach me not to be afraid of my body. Teach me not to hide my face." Her words pierced in a different way. Teaching was dangerous in the life he lived. It meant involvement and investment. It meant holding someone not as an asset, but as a person, and alphas were not traditionally in the business of love. Elias felt something unclench then, as if a muscle he'd been using for years relaxed and left a raw space. He did not know if that space would be filled with authority or with tenderness. Before he could promise more than he ought, the precinct's bell chimed once, a thin hawk scrape of sound. Micah entered with a look that cooled the room. "We have movement," he said. "A packet of vampires has come through the old sewers. They demand to observe your next steps, Alpha. Lysander has sent a formal summons. They say the coven grows impatient." The news arrived like a shift in the wind. Patience was not the coven's usual currency. Impatience spelled pressure. Elias felt the world narrow to a corridor of two choices: yield to the court's ritual and risk letting the coven lay hands on Mira under the excuse of cleansing, or resist and risk giving Lysander cause to press harder, to call in favors and tear at the borders he'd worked to mend. He thought of the night's earlier image, Mira's fingers denting his sleeve, her nails comet-shaped tracks on his skin. That smallness, that fear, had lodged in him with the persistence of a lodged shard. He could obey the treaty and sacrifice the girl to spectacle, or he could make a choice that would set dangerous precedents and possibly cost him his alphahood. He had led his pack through winter hunger and quiet feuds. He had negotiated with men whose smiles were studded with knives. He had believed in the sanctity of the pact as one believes in gravity. But looking at Mira, imagining her alone in a ritual circle, watched by men whose hands took and did not ask for consent, the weight of continuity felt suddenly hollow. "Tell Lysander well, allow an observer," Elias said, the words hard and precise. "But the observer will be kept at the perimeter. No ritual until we have full reports from healer Anna and a witness from the fishermen of the East Quay. No harm to Mira under any guise." Micah's jaw tightened, but he bowed his head. "And if Lysander refuses? Then we make them refuse in front of the council," Elias said. "We make them choose whether they want spectacle or truth." It was, he knew, a gamble. A gamble against seasoned predators, against pacts written in the ink of centuries. The lid of the world he had known rattled at the edges. But as he walked back to Mira, the Alpha felt the first dangerous stirrings of something else, a determination not to let old men in velvet make a theater out of a child's life. He had bargaining chips. He had men who trusted his voice. He also had a woman on a bench who had called him out without knowing his name. The call he made in that moment would be the first move in a game of escalation, and the consequences would be more than political bruises. Mira looked up when he returned to the infirmary, and under the lamp's pool of light, she was no longer merely a subject of ancient risk, but a person with a sharp, aching claim on his attention. She met his gaze with something that was not gratitude, not yet, but a trust that sprouted like a fragile weed through cracked stone. "Then don't let them take me," she said simply. He wanted to promise her the moon. Instead, he offered the only thing he could be sure would hold: his word and the plan it carried. "I won't," he said. "I will not let them take you while there is breath in my pack to stop it." It was not a grand vow. It was not a decree that could be carved into statute. It was, however, the beginning of a choice that would pull at the fabric of his leadership, and at the center of that tug, he felt a strange, liberating terror. The first blow came without ceremony. A rumor, thin as a thread, snapped through the precinct and left a bruise across the pack's face. It began in the infirmary, where word always gathered like dust. A servant, overhearing Lysander's envoy laugh too loudly in the wine cellar. A messenger smuggling a folded note into the hands of a disgruntled late-night guard. And it spread faster than ink. Old Vela had been paid. The coven had not merely required a bargain, they had bought a weapon. Elias felt the room tilt as if an unseen hand had shoved him. The accusation had the shape of a blade. It demanded a name and found one. Vela's eyes had flicked, once only, when Lysander had mentioned advantage with the tides. The motion had been small, but it had been there. A mark of calculation, not grief. The thought that the witch who had raised a girl's life like a coin to be spent for the coven's gain was a betrayal, measured differently than fear. It became personal. "Micah," Elias started to say, but Micah's hand on his arm stopped him. The old second's face was a hard map of weathered trust. "We must not let anger be our counsel. If Vela colluded, there are threads to pull. But if this reaches the coven, they'll call us reckless. They want a show." Vela stood in the council like a rock people blamed for shipwrecks. Her fingers twisted a shawl, sea-scented and salt-stiff. "I was paid," she said, before Elias could command the silence. The word broke the room like a bottle. "I took coin and grain and a promise of sanctuary for my kin when the tides turned. I thought I was clever. I thought I was trading risk into safety. I did not know the bargain would be stole." "Stole?" Lysander's smile was a pit. "The coven paid you, witch." "We were satisfied." "Paid by whom?" Vala's voice turned sharp like a reef sliced into. "You think the coven is a single throat? No. Men within the court sought leverage, and we traded what we had. I pledged a child marked to change tides. I pledged—" her eyes snagged on Mira. "I pledged someone who would answer to the bride moon. I did not pledge a child that answered to a shadowing moon. That was not my spell." The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. Elias understood the arithmetic of deception. If someone within the coven had redirected payments, stole them into a private pocket, then old Vala had not been acting alone. The implication crawled up his spine. Someone had been buying ends that weren't sanctioned. Someone among the velvet could have acted to build a private advantage, and a frightened girl had been the coin. Mira's laugh, when it fluttered out, was cut with hysteria. "So they used me like a tool? They signed me to be bait? They sold my knights to buy a favor? How can they?" Her words frayed into sobs, and then a flat, deadly silence. "My family left because of you. June needs work. My mother prays to the sea at dawn and asks why. You call that sanctity?" "It was a contract," Vala said, the confession a flint in her throat. "Contracts bind by ink and price. I made a choice, and I am sorry. But remorse doesn't unmake the change. If the coven used it to mask other plans—" "We'll need proof," Micah said. "If we accuse the coven without showing weight, they'll twist it. They'll twist us into compliance. Lysander will call for public measures. They'll make an example. Examples feed obedience, Lysander said softly, like a man describing a garden he tended with care. An undisciplined anomaly threatens more than a child. It threatens order. If the pack cannot control its feral members, we control them, Micah snapped. We have custody. That is our responsibility. Custody is a word for a cage, Mira shot back. You don't get to cage me and call it care. The conversation unspooled into 1,000 tangles, accusations, half-admissions, the subtle art of posturing for advantage. Elias felt more than heard. He felt pulled taut between the rawness of Mira's need and the cold machinery of ages-old politics. He had always performed the ritual of diplomacy like a man reciting prayers, but this felt less like a ritual and more like a betrayal stitched into the city. He knew the forms of power, the coven's velvet, the vampire's bite, the witch's bargains. He had never believed those forms required cruelty to endure. Now he was not sure. A whisper moved through the pack like a wind through ruined houses. The rogue beta, Garen, had been seen slipping from the docks late at night. Garen, who had been second to a previous alpha, a hothead who'd nursed grievances like wounds. Garen, who wanted more of his bite recognized by the pack, who liked the idea of severity when it consolidated his rank. If elders smelled weakness, Garen would be the scent that followed. And Lysander, who had been stirring the coven's hunger for spectacle, had reasons to feed such embers. Garen chose that moment to speak. He came into the council with the swagger of someone who had a right to be heard. The room shifted at his presence. "We keep her, and we let the coven walk," he said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "Or we hand the coven what they want and keep our heads. I say we take the chance for stability. Blood has to be cleaner than chaos." There was a pause like a held breath. Some of the older pack members, weary of endless bargain and slow-rotted patience, leaned forward. Garen's words were syrup to mouths that had tasted power. The angle cut clean. Cut ties with truth and get a stable bargain, or risk everything on a girl who might answer to a moon no one understood. Elias felt fury rise, not the cold political fury that sharpened strategy, but a raw animal heat at the sight of a man measuring lives for his own climb. "We do not hand our people to become playing pieces," he said. "We will not commodify lives for the convenience of the coven. We will seek proof. We will not give in to fear and greedy hands." Garen's smirk soured into a snarl. "You can't coddle sentiment and expect to remain alpha. The city is not run by kindness, Elias. It's run by appetite. If you refuse, the coven will not leave quietly." "There are other ways," Micah said. "If the coven demands spectacle, we can deny them. We can appeal to the council and the human magistrates. We can make them choose between ritual and ruin. Or we can be toppled," Garen said flatly. "An alpha who can't keep his pack from being a liability is a failed alpha." The words landed like hammers. Elias felt the ground beneath him tremble, not from any external force, but because power within his own borders was shifting. Garen's threat was not empty. A coup could be simple. Whisper a rumor, break a confidence, and the pack's fear would do the rest. Politics lived in fear as much as in calculations. When a man's stomach was empty and his hands wanted more, he could justify anything. Mira shrank at the exchange. Her hands clenched into fists, nails biting blood into her palm. "You should all be ashamed," she said, voice ragged. "You'd throw me to their spectacle to save your titles. You galvanize me like I'm a coin you can spend. I thought packs kept people." Her words were not a plea anymore. They were an indictment. They opened old wounds in men who prided themselves on discipline and left those who had weaknesses exposed as well. For a fleeting second, Elias saw the pack as a mirror. Some faces softened, others hardened. Micah's jaw worked. A few older members shifted closer to the door. Garen's eyes were knives waiting for a throat. When the meeting adjourned, like something that had been struck and then cooled, Elias crossed the hall to Mira as if distance could make a promise truer. He found her in the stairwell, her shoulders trembling, a small figure in the great building's bones. "Don't let them take me," she said again, but this time the plea had a brittle edge of danger. "Don't make me an argument for someone else's security." His hand went to her arm. It was a small human gesture, and for a moment she did not flinch. "I won't," he said, "but you must understand. I understand enough." Her teeth were tight. "I understand that I am a danger to them and a bargaining chip to others. I understand they will take me if they have the chance. I understand you can keep me only until they decide I'm worth a bigger thing than your words." The anger in her voice was a hard, bright thing. It cut through the thread of diplomacy he'd wrapped around himself. Elias wanted to tell her that he had plans bigger than speeches. He wanted to show her the evidence he would find, the allies he would quiet, the way he'd engineered delay like a siege. Instead, when he opened his mouth, Garen's name came out, a warning he shouldn't have to give. "Garen will not stop," he said. "If he gets his chance, he'll use any pretext to force a change." Mira's laugh was thin and humorless. "Then he'll try. People always try. They swing for what is easy." That night, the pack's precinct felt less like a refuge and more like a pressure chamber. Men spoke in clipped sentences. Vela muttered to herself in the infirmary, while her hands pretended to mend torn cloth. Lysander's envoy stayed in the shadows near the wine room, polishing a glass with the languid attention of a cat. Garen moved like a shadow with teeth. Information shifted hands like contraband. A guard with a debt to pay was seen speaking to a pale man near the docks. A fisherman who had once taken a coin from the coven told his wife he would not be a witness if it meant trouble. The city seemed to sieve itself into factions, and Mira, the girl who answered to the wrong moon, was the grain. Elias tried to steady the swirl by making plans. He called Anna, the healer, to run further assays. He sent 2 scouts to the coastal town where the Santos had fled, instructing them to look for marks of coercion or purchase. He asked a magistrate for records of coven payments. He worked like a man trying to dam a flood with stones. But plans are fragile things when people hunger. Garen's influence moved like mold across bread, slowly, leaving rot where there would have been sustenance. By dawn, there were enough murmurs to transform suspicion into action. Garen had met in the night with men who disliked Elias' methodical shoes. He had found a cadre willing to pretend they feared the coven more than they feared their own leader. The first small betrayal took the shape of absence. 2 guards who had once stood at Mira's door did not show up for their watch. A note was left in its place. "We cannot be party to this." When Mira discovered the empty watch, she did not beg. She packed without ceremony, stuffing a thin satchel with bread and a bottle and the small knife her brother had given her. She moved like someone who had been practicing leaving for a long time. When Elias found her at the outer gate, dusk making the river silver again, her eyes were flat, tired as old glass. "They'll take me," she said. The words were mere fact, not surrender. "You can't go out alone. The coven will—" "They won't have to take me if I leave," she said. There was something dangerous in her palms, the set of a person who had been run too long. "I won't be an example. I won't be your argument. I'm leaving to protect them from having to choose. Maybe if I'm gone, they'll go after me and not your pack. Maybe they'll find it easier. But I won't be pulled into a ritual. Elias's mouth hardened in a way that felt like a break. You cannot run and expect me to do nothing. Do nothing, she said, and there was an edge to the phrase, as if she were daring him to be what he had always been, an alpha who kept things contained and clean, an alpha who chose expediency. Do nothing, and they will take me the same. Do what you must, but do not ask me to wait for a verdict that will dress my life in their fears. He could feel Garen's eyes, real or imagined, on his back, the pack's house already murmuring with second-guessing. To stop her would mean force. To let her go would mean relinquishment of the only person he'd allowed himself to guard from the machinery of law. Either choice promised fracture. Mira's hand was already on the gate when Garen's men, 3 of them, faces set like bricks, rounded the corner. Their voices were quick, decisive. "Alpha Elias," one called. "Garen says the pack has had enough. He wants to settle this his way." Something inside Elias broke that had not broken before. It wasn't his authority. It wasn't even fear. It was the simple, naked recognition of what his leadership would cost a person if he let it. He could have shouted for restraint. He could have signaled for Micah. But when Mira looked back at him then, the trust in her eyes, so fragile it could be blown out, made the choice for him. "I won't let you take her," he said, and his voice was not merely command. It was a crack in the old armor, father and lover and alpha all tumbling into one messy claim. Garen's laugh was thin. "Then you'll die in the attempt," he said. Mira didn't wait for the outcome. At the exact second a fist, friends or foes, was raised, she slipped past the men with a small speed that was all terror and instinct. The alley swallowed her, the river took her trail like a mouth, and the pack's precinct burst into motion a second too late. They hunted her as if hunting a quarry. Garen smiled like a man satisfied with a simple victory. Lysander felt vindicated and moved his pawn with deliberate slowness. The pack splintered. Some ran with Elias into the night. Others whispered treason under their breath. The fracture had bled past politics into people. Elias ran like a man with the moon carved into his chest. He had failed to hold the city together by promise alone. Now the chase would be a different kind of test, one not of laws, but of the heart. As he followed Mira's disappearing silhouette into the fog that gathered over the quay, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The fracture was not only political now, it was intimate. A girl he had sworn to protect had fled. A beta had shown teeth. A witch had confessed to greed. And in the place where all those things intersected, Elias felt a revelation that hurt. The old contracts had been paper-thin, and the people who lived under them were not lines in treaties, but living, trembling bodies who did not belong to anyone but themselves. He did not know where Mira would go. He only knew the sick, unwelcome certainty that the coven would not let an anomaly disappear without trying to make an example. He tasted salt on his tongue, and it was not merely rain. It was the sea calling, and the knowledge that some bargains were made with too few hands. He would have to unmake them. But the pack was wounded, the coven suspicious, and a man named Garen had just shown the city how fragile his command was. As Elias sprinted into the fog, the city behind him throbbed with thin, ancient lights, each one a window into another life, another bargain, another fragment that might, if tended, be mended. Or it might be the place where the pack's old seams finally ripped open. They chased until the quay became a blur of ropes and salt smell and the rhythmic slap of water against pilings. Mira's steps were lighter than the men behind her, a desperate sort of life that belonged to someone used to slipping through small spaces, to vanishing between the ribs of a town that had always been kinder to the overlooked. Elias followed her like gravity, not because he could match her speed, but because he would not let the world eat her for sport. The fog was a living thing, and Mira melted into it as if the tide itself were a conspirator. Lantern light cut half-ghosts out of the air. Garan's men called her name like a curse. For a moment, Elias thought he would find only the echo of her boots. He imagined her at the river's edge, shuddering with exhaustion. And he imagined Lysander arriving with a ritual and a velvet smile and a torch to make spectacle of a child's body. The thought made something in him harden and then soft at once. The Alpha who had always selected currency over compassion now weighed what he would burn his rank for. He found her where the old chapel's ruins met the dock, a place where pacts had once been forged in stone and alcohol and young men's bravado. The ocean breathed under the arches like a slow animal. Mira stood with her back to the ruined altar, the moon breaking the fog into a wafer of white that made her hair look like a halo of wet thread. "Garin sent men," she said without looking at him. Her voice was steady in that way brave people become when they're beyond fear and into something sterner. "He wants you to pick. He said the coven would demand a ritual if I stayed. He said you'd cave." "He's trying to break us," Elias said. His chest felt tight as if he had swallowed an oar. "He'll make the city prefer order to justice if we let him." Mira turned then, and the moonlight picked out the thin, defiant set of her jaw. "Then stop him," she said simply. "Stop the man who would sell us. Stop the coven that would make me a show. Or don't. But don't let your silence be the thing that kills me." Something feral answered within Elias, not the practiced, territorial hunger of an alpha, but a private, incendiary grief for the life he had let a system claim. He heard the pack's footfalls on the stones, felt Micah's presence like a steady rock at his shoulder. Garen's voice echoed from the path behind them, a chorus of harshness flanked by men who had chosen their appetite over any nobler politics. "You would make a scene," Garen said as they closed in, voice laced with triumph. "You would have us be rebels and lose everything for one girl's saving. Are you willing to lose the pack for romance, Elias? For a girl you don't know?" The question landed like a spear, meant to gouge more than wound. It had been designed to reduce him to a caricature so others could act. Elias looked at Mira, at the mess of her hair, the dirt under her nails, the bright anger that had not yet been blunted by despair. And the answer rose inside him like a tide he had not been taught to control. "I am willing to lose the alpha the pack expects," he said quietly. "I am not willing to lose a person." Garen laughed and raised his hand to signal the men. The movement was a small, violent thing. For a second, it looked as if the next breath of the city would be the sound of a blow landing. Mira didn't wait. She moved toward the water and then turned to face them with the kind of reckless clarity that had become her armor. If they wanted to take her, they would have to do it in water and salt and with the whole night as witness. Elias's choice uncoiled in him like an old animal. He stepped in front of her. "You will not touch her," he said to Garen, and there was no alpha in the sentence, as much as there was a man who had finally named his line. Garen lunged. The scuffle that followed was brutal and small, a flaying of coats and breath. Micah moved like a blade of mercy, and the pack split, some forming rings of containment, others watching as if the outcome would grant them permission to be cruel or kind. Elias felt Garen's hands on his throat for a second, the man's teeth close to his temple, and a flash of old terror, of losing everything to ambition, went hot through him. Then a sound cut through the melee, a howl, not animal, but human broken, that vibrated off stone. Mira had shifted in the chaos, a ghost of movement and salt and something like power. And the moon, fished through fog, touched her skin in a way it had not that night in the wharf. The change was not the slavish horror the coven had promised. It came with a keen, trembling beauty. Her bones lengthened and arched, her eyes reflected the gray sea, and for a heartbeat, Elias saw not a weapon, but a living thing, terrified of itself, and yet whole. Garen faltered at the sight. He had imagined monsters as blunt instruments. He had not prepared for an animal that trembled. The hesitation was enough. Elias seized Garen's arm and twisted with a practiced motion that sent the rogue beta sprawling into the cold stones. The pack moved to bind him, not to slay him. The decision to take a life had been, for the moment, stayed. But the coven would not wait for mercy. Lantern light flared, and Lysander's envoy emerged from the fog like a pale bloom, backed by pale men who thrummed with arrogance. The envoy's hand went to a packet at his belt, a ritual band glinting with silver. His smile was a practiced cut. "You are making a grave decision, Alpha Marlowe," Lysander said, all silk and teeth. "Either you hand the anomaly to the coven, or you make yourselves the enemy of an order that will not forgive such indulgence." Elias felt the eyes of his pack like a weight, and the look on Mira's face like a steel rod. She was changing back as he watched, the rough edges of transformation softening, but leaving wet streaks on her cheeks. She was not a spectacle. She was a person whose edges had been reshaped by violence and who now stood naked under the world's curiosity. "You may demand anything you like," Elias said, "but you will not have her under force. If you push for ritual without consent, we will call the magistrates. We will expose whatever corruption you have wrapped in velvet. We will not be made accomplices." Lysander's smile thinned. "You would call the magistrates to defy the coven? The city knows us." "Then let the city see us," Elias said, and the words surprised him by the ferocity they carried. "Let them see what you buy and who you sell. This is not mine alone, Lysander. This is a matter of law." A tense silence knifed the air. Garen spat blood and bitter words. Some of his followers wavered. Old men in the coven's fold measured the possible ruins. The envoy had the look of a man who had expected guile and instead found spectacle denied. Lysander chose spectacle. He lifted the silver band and spoke a fragment of old liturgy. The air trembled. For a second, Elias thought the night would tear and something terrible would sweep them all away. Then Mira, small, wet, shaking, stepped forward and did the thing that unmade the planned theater. She spoke. "No, ritual," she said. "Not on my body, not by your hands. If you want proof, you come with witnesses and a court. You try to steal me, and we'll burn the contracts you hide behind." Her voice carried beyond her years. It carried the honesty of someone who had been reduced to a tool and wanted instead to be a person. The coven hesitated, the men in velvet exchanging glances like traitors. In the pause, Micah moved, a small, brave defiance, and called for the magistrate. Someone had a line to the human courts, to the one place the coven feared: public record. It happened then like the sudden turning of the tide. The magistrate's men were slower than the coven, but steadier in their procedures. They arrived with stamped paper and a summons that smelled of civic finality. Lysander's envoy bit his lip and receded. Garen's men scattered when the law took a more durable form than their personal hunger. In the thin aftermath, Mira slid down against the ruined altar and breathed like a person who had just refused to be the thing everyone expected of her. Elias knelt beside her, blood and salt on his sleeves. He could have offered policies, broached new pacts, plotted revenge. Instead, he reached out and took her hand in both of his. An alpha's grip turned gentle. "You were right to run," he said, voice stripped of the rehearsed cadences of leadership. "And you were right to stay when you did. You chose your life. That was the right thing." Mira's laugh was small and wet. "You could have let them take me," she said. "I could have," he admitted, "and I would have lived with it. I would have known that I let a system take an innocent, and that would have eaten me. I don't want to be that man." Her eyes found his then, the armor gone, the calculation bare. The city had shifted. The coven had been stalled. Garen was bound and bruised, not broken. The cost had been sharp, reputation dented, alliances fraying, the peace between ancient houses now a question mark. But in the ruins' hush, something softer had been claimed. "Stay," Elias said suddenly, not as command but as offering. "Stay with us. Learn. We will teach you to control what happens, to read the tides that call you. We will make this a place where you are not a coin." Mira's fingers curled around his. For a moment, she simply looked at him, tasting the edges of his words as if they were an unfamiliar salt. "Teach me," she said, "but not because you pity me. Teach me because you want me." The confession startled him with its boldness. It was not the declamation of lovers in romance novels. It was the dangerous, honest thing two people say when the war around them has thinned the world to its essentials. Elias felt his resolve shift from the policy he had always kept to the private promise forming in his chest. "I want you," he said, and the truth of it surprised him with its clarity. Not as a symbol, not as a problem, as someone I'll stand beside. Mira's laugh folded into a sob that was almost relief. The moon watched them from behind veils of fog, indifferent but steady. Around them, the pack gathered in ragged forgiveness and exhausted loyalty. Old Vela stood a little apart, her face marked by a shame that is a kind of prayer. Lysander had been stilled for now, not defeated but checked. Garen would be dealt with by the pack and by law. Love in their world was not a neat, immediate victory. It was a series of choices that would have to be defended and re-argued, a tender graft on an old tree. But in the ruined chapel, with the sea stitching the night back together, Elias and Mira made the first of those choices, to risk their names and their safety for one another. He lifted her hand, kissed the salt at her knuckles, and for the first time in a long while, the city felt like it might survive on something else besides contracts and fear. It might survive on the precarious, dangerous thing that makes people brave enough to defy the rules written by men who forgot what it meant to be human. There would be more battles, trials with the Coven, Garen's eventual attempt at power, the long, slow work of teaching Mira to listen to strange moons without becoming what the city feared. But that night, the tide favored them. The pack, who had once believed only in the sanctity of pact, now had a leader who would bend an old law for the sake of a living heart. As dawn took the fog, Elias held Mira against the ruined stone and let the new vulnerability be an offering. It was not a perfect peace. It was a beginning. They did not get everything they wanted overnight. The Coven grumbled, then schemed. Lysander sent polite letters and colder smiles, and the magistrate demanded hearings that would take months. Garen hissed promises of revenge from a cell whose bars were more symbolic than iron. Old Vela retreated to the places where her shame could be salted and tended, offering what help she could with hands that trembled but knew coastal magics. But the immediate violence, the ritual, the public bloodletting, the bargain made into a spectacle had been stopped. That counted for something. The precinct became, in the weeks that followed, less a house of procedure and more a home of stubborn reparation. Mira slept in the small room above the infirmary where the salt smell was constant and the window looked toward the quay. Anna hung herbs around the rafters and taught her which scents calmed a body before a moonwake. Micah and a small circle of long-trusted lieutenants showed her how a pack read tracks and tides, how to move feet to make prints ordinary, how to speak so that men understood her as a person and not a danger. They laughed at mistakes, Mira's attempt to howl a proper pack call that sounded like a gull with a cold, and corrected each other gently. It was ridiculous and tender in equal measures. Elias learned the less flattering lessons of humility. He convened the council less as a man who expected obedience and more as one who pleaded for patient excavation of truth. He took the magistrate's summons seriously, not as a slight but as a necessary airing. He walked through the docks and the markets with Mira at his side, letting the city see her as she was. Not a cursed instrument, but a woman who lived and laughed and staggered sometimes under fear. People noticed. Some softened, some recoiled. The world did not change in a sweep, but faces shifted enough to make a dent.
There were brutal nights, when Mira flinched at moonlight, when she woke with clawed sheets and the taste of iron, when the threat of coven reprisals arrived as a bundled threat of petitions and veiled donations. There were also mornings of small triumphs, Mira naming a current before a fisherman, helping Anna stabilize a neighbor who had been marked by fever, standing in the council to read a clause about consent aloud and watching how a room paid attention when a young voice refused to be ignored. Over time, the pact itself was rewoven. Elias insisted on clauses no parchment had seen before, explicit protections against non-consensual rituals, a binding requirement of public record for any coven transaction, a shared oversight committee with human magistrates. It was small victories stacked into something larger. The coven grumbled but found its power checked in small lawful ways. The pack owed Elias debts of loyalty not merely for his strength, but for his willingness to be accountable. The most dangerous thing, perhaps, was the way their relationship settled into something real and stubborn. It did not announce itself with fanfare. It grew in the tangles of ordinary care. Elias waiting outside the infirmary while Mira slept, fingers splayed against the door as if to keep the night from remembering her as prey. Mira sewing a small ridiculous wolf into the hem of his favorite jacket because he forgot to eat too often. They argued over tactics and theories, then laughed like conspirators over terrible coffee. When the moon tugged and Mira's breath hitched, he would hold her until the tides inside her eased. When he faltered under council pressure, she would braid her fingers in his and remind him that being an alpha did not mean he was immune to being scared. One morning, months after the chase at the ruined chapel, they walked together to the cliff that overlooked the sea. The city below was a smudge of roofs and smoke. The river unwound itself toward the horizon like a ribbon. The sky was clean, a pale burnished blue, and for the first time the moon was a thin, indifferent slice in daylight, a reminder rather than a demand. Mira leaned into him, forehead against his shoulder, salt wind tangling their hair. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, voice soft as gull feathers. He held her a little tighter and thought of the ledger of choices that had made him. He thought of forms he had signed and faces he had denied. He thought of the night she had gripped his sleeve and the way the city had held its breath. "I regret the time I wasted believing the world needed protection more than people did," he admitted. "But not this. Not you." She smiled, small and fierce. "Then teach me the tides," she said, "and let me teach you to be less afraid of breaking the rules when the rules break people." They watched the river catch the sun like a promise. Below, the city moved on, bargaining and living, making small pacts and new mistakes.
On the cliff, they were a private sort of revolution. An alpha who had chosen tenderness over ceremony, and a girl who had refused to be reduced to fear. Their hands found each other's, fingers knitting in a way that had nothing to do with treaties and everything to do with choice. The moon slid backward toward the hem of the sky, indifferent and steady. Mira pressed her face to Elias's chest, listening to the slow certainty of his heartbeat. Around them, the wind stitched the old pact into a new hem, and for a breath that felt as wide as the world, being human, messy, brave, imperfect, felt like enough.